A man does not wake up one day and decide to change. That is a comforting lie. What actually happens is quieter and far more disturbing. There comes a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when he realizes that everything he calls himself is nothing more than a pattern of borrowed behaviors, reactions he didn't choose, beliefs he never examined, weaknesses he learned to protect. And once he sees it, he cannot unsee it. That is where the real danger begins, because the moment you become aware of your own construction, you are faced with a question most people spend their lives avoiding. If this is not truly you, then what is? Most people retreat at this point. They distract themselves. They reinforce their habits. They cling harder to the identity they were given. Not because it is true, but because it is familiar. Familiarity feels like safety. But Nietzsche understood something most refuse to confront. Safety is often just a well-decorated prison. The individual you currently are is not an achievement. It is an accumulation, a collection of compromises shaped by fear, approval, and repetition. You were trained to become acceptable long before you were capable of becoming powerful. And so you learn to soften your instincts, to dilute your thoughts, to negotiate your own potential in exchange for belonging. You call this maturity. Nietzsche would call it decay. There is a reason why the idea of killing your old self feels uncomfortable. It is not because it is extreme. It is because it is accurate. Transformation is not additive. It is destructive. You do not become something new by layering improvement on top of weakness. You become something new by eliminating what makes you predictable. And predictability is the foundation of control. Observe any man who is easy to manipulate. His patterns are visible. His reactions are consistent. His fears are known. He believes he is acting freely, but every move he makes can be anticipated. He is not being controlled by others. He is being controlled by himself, or more precisely, by the version of himself he refuses to abandon. Nietzsche did not romanticize growth. He did not frame it as a journey of self-discovery filled with clarity and peace. He saw it for what it is, a confrontation, a violent separation between who you have been and what you could become. And most people are not capable of surviving that separation, because the old self does not disappear willingly. It resists. It negotiates. It whispers. It tells you to wait, to be reasonable, to avoid unnecessary risk, to maintain stability. It sounds rational, but it is not. It is preservation disguised as logic. The old self does not want you to evolve. It wants you to remain recognizable, because recognition is safe. If you remain consistent, others know how to deal with you. They know your limits, your boundaries, your breaking points. But once you begin to change in a way that cannot be predicted, you become difficult to manage. And difficulty creates distance. This is why transformation often leads to isolation. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer easy to categorize. People are not threatened by your success. They are threatened by your unpredictability. The version of you they understood is disappearing, and in its place, something unfamiliar is forming. Nietzsche described this process as a form of self-overcoming. But what he implied, without softening it, is that overcoming yourself requires a certain level of internal cruelty, not toward others, toward your own illusions. You must be willing to look at your habits without justification, to see your weaknesses without defending them, to recognize that many of your choices are not driven by intention, but by avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of rejection, avoidance of uncertainty. And once you identify these patterns, you face a decision. Do you continue protecting them, or do you remove them? Most choose protection, because removal is not clean. It does not feel like progress. It feels like loss. You lose parts of your identity, parts of your personality, even parts of your relationships, because the old self is not isolated. It is connected to everything around you, the way you speak, the way you respond, the way others perceive you. To destroy it is to disrupt the structure of your entire life. And disruption carries consequences. Nietzsche did not promise comfort. He pointed toward something else. Power. But not the kind most people imagine. Not dominance over others. Dominance over the internal forces that dictate your behavior. The ability to act without needing validation. to remain stable without external reassurance, to make decisions without negotiating with fear. This is not natural. It is cultivated through repetition, through awareness, through the deliberate rejection of your own impulses. Every time you choose discipline over comfort, you weaken the old self. Every time you refuse to react emotionally, you interrupt its patterns. Every time you act without seeking approval, you detach from its influence. And slowly, something shifts. Not dramatically, not visibly, but internally. Control begins to consolidate. You become less reactive, less predictable, less dependent. And in that state, you become harder to manipulate, because manipulation requires access to your emotions, your insecurities, your need for validation. Remove those, and the mechanisms lose their effectiveness. This is where most misunderstand Nietzsche. They assume this transformation makes you cold, detached, unfeeling, but that is not entirely accurate. It makes you selective. You still experience emotion. You simply no longer obey it. There is a difference. Obedience is weakness. Awareness is control. The old self does not understand this distinction. It reacts immediately. It justifies its reactions. It believes that intensity is authenticity, but intensity without control is exposure. It reveals too much, and what is revealed can be used. This is why those who operate with quiet control often appear distant. It is not distance. It is containment. They have learned that expression without intention is vulnerability, and vulnerability, when misplaced, becomes leverage. Nietzsche's philosophy is often misunderstood as nihilistic, but it is not about meaninglessness. It is about removing inherited meaning, so you can impose your own, and that requires destruction. Not symbolic destruction, actual internal dismantling. You must question everything you have accepted about yourself. Not once, repeatedly, because the mind adapts. It finds new ways to preserve old patterns under different names. You believe you have changed, but in reality, you have only rebranded your habits. The process must be continuous, relentless, uncomfortable. There is no final version of yourself waiting to be discovered. There is only the constant elimination of what no longer serves your control. And this is where most fail, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack the willingness to endure the absence of identity. When you remove the old self, there is a period where nothing replaces it. No clear direction, no stable sense of who you are. Only silence, and that silence is unsettling because identity provides structure, even if that structure is limiting. Without it, you feel exposed, undefined, but this is the necessary phase, the space between who you were and what you are constructing. Most rush through it. They adopt new identities too quickly, new beliefs, new behaviors, new personas. But if the foundation has not been cleared, the old self simply integrates into the new form, and the cycle continues. True transformation requires patience, not passive patience, active restraint. The discipline to remain undefined until your actions become intentional, until your behavior is chosen, not inherited, until your responses are measured, not automatic. At that point, the new self begins to take shape, not as a fixed identity, but as a controlled system, flexible, adaptive, resistant to external influence. This is what Nietzsche pointed toward, with the idea of becoming who you are, not discovering a hidden essence, but creating a structure that cannot be easily manipulated, a self that is not dependent on consistency, but on control, and control is not visible. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself through absence, the absence of unnecessary reaction, the absence of impulsive behavior, the absence of external validation. It is quiet, and because it is quiet, it is often underestimated. But those who understand power recognize it immediately, because it cannot be forced, it cannot be influenced easily, and it cannot be predicted, which makes it difficult to contain. The old self, in contrast, is loud. It seeks recognition. It demands reassurance. It reacts visibly. And in doing so, it provides information. Information that can be observed, analyzed, and used. This is why destroying the old self is not an act of self-improvement. It is an act of self-defense. You are removing the parts of you that can be exploited, the parts that make you readable, the parts that respond without thinking, and in their place, you are building something less accessible, less transparent, more controlled. This does not make you isolated. It makes your interactions intentional. You choose when to engage, when to reveal, when to withdraw, not based on emotion, but based on awareness. And awareness is what separates those who are influenced from those who influence. Nietzsche did not offer comfort, because comfort weakens observation. When you are comfortable, you stop analyzing. You accept. You settle. But when you are slightly uncomfortable, you remain alert. You question. You observe. And observation leads to understanding. Understanding leads to control. And control is what most people are unconsciously seeking. Not happiness, not fulfillment. Control. Over themselves, over their environment, over the uncertainty that defines existence. But control cannot be achieved while you are still operating as your old self, because the old self was not designed for control. It was designed for adaptation, for fitting in, for survival within a system, not for independence from it. To become independent, you must become unfamiliar, even to yourself. Your thoughts will change, your reactions will shift, your priorities will detach from what once felt important, and this will create friction, internally and externally. Others will notice. They may not understand, but they will feel the difference, because the version of you they interacted with is no longer present, and humans are sensitive to absence, especially the absence of predictability. Some will attempt to pull you back, not intentionally, but instinctively. They will reference your past behavior, expect your usual responses, test your boundaries, and in those moments, the process is tested. Do you revert, or do you maintain control? Every time you revert, the old self regains ground. Every time you maintain, it weakens further. This is not a single decision. It is a series of decisions. Repeated, consistent, unnoticed by most, but decisive in outcome. Over time, the old self loses influence. Not completely. It never disappears entirely, but it becomes quieter, less dominant, more distant. And eventually, it becomes something else. Not an identity, but a reference, a reminder of what you once were, and what you chose to leave behind. At that point, something changes. Not in how others see you, but in how you operate. You no longer seek to prove anything, because proof requires an audience, and your actions are no longer driven by observation. They are driven by intention. You act because it aligns with your structure, not because it produces a reaction. This is where control stabilizes, where behavior becomes precise, where responses are measured, and where influence becomes possible, not through force, but through positioning. You understand patterns, you recognize behavior, you see reactions before they fully form, because you have already observed them within yourself. The old self becomes a map, a way to interpret others, their insecurities, their impulses, their need for validation. And once you can see these patterns, you understand something most ignore. People do not need to be controlled. They control themselves through their habits, their fears, their desires. And all that is required is awareness to see it, to recognize it, to avoid being drawn into it. Because the moment you react, you re-enter the system you tried to leave. You become predictable again, accessible, influenceable. This is why the process never truly ends, because the moment you believe you have complete control, you stop observing, and the old patterns begin to return, quietly, subtly, almost unnoticeable, until they are active again. So the elimination must continue, not aggressively, not obsessively, but consistently. You monitor your reactions, you question your impulses, you remove what compromises your control, and you reinforce what strengthens it. Over time, this becomes automatic, not a struggle, but a standard, and in that state, you are no longer trying to become something. You are maintaining something, a structure, a system, a self that is not easily influenced, not easily read, not easily controlled, and that changes everything. Because the world does not operate on fairness. It operates on awareness. Those who understand themselves understand others. Those who control themselves are difficult to control. And those who remove their weaknesses remove access points. The old self was full of access points, predictable reactions, visible insecurities, uncontrolled impulses. It was open, exposed, available, and that made it vulnerable. Destroying it was not an act of aggression. It was an act of necessity, because in a system where behavior is constantly observed, what is predictable is eventually used, and what is used becomes a limitation. So the process remains quiet, unseen, continuous. You remove, you refine, you observe, you adjust, not to become better, but to become less accessible, less predictable, less dependent. And in doing so, you achieve something most never fully understand, not freedom, but control over what influences you, which is the closest thing to freedom that exists. Oh! In the end, the idea was never to find your true self. There was never anything waiting to be discovered. Only something waiting to be removed. And once enough has been removed, what remains is not who you were meant to be. It is simply what could not be controlled. There is a point in this process where nothing dramatic happens, and that is how you know it is real. No surge of clarity, no feeling of arrival, no visible transformation that others can recognize and applaud. Only a quiet shift in how you respond. The same situations appear, the same provocations, the same subtle attempts to pull you back into familiar patterns. But something is missing. The reaction. Where there was once urgency, there is now pause. Where there was once impulse, there is now observation. Where there was once a need to respond, there is now a choice not to. This is where the old self finally loses its authority, not because it was defeated, but because it is no longer obeyed. Most people imagine transformation as becoming someone new, but that assumption is flawed. Becoming something new still relies on identity, and identity is still a structure that can be influenced. What has been built here is different. It is not an identity. It is a position from which you can observe your own behavior without being consumed by it. A position from which emotion is experienced, but not followed blindly. A position where thought is no longer automatic, but deliberate. This is why the process feels empty at first, because what has been removed was never replaced with something equally loud. The noise is gone, and in its place, there is silence. Most cannot tolerate that silence. They rush to fill it with distractions, with new roles, with borrowed beliefs that feel just convincing enough to hold on to. But filling the silence recreates the old structure. Different shape, same weakness. The few who resist that impulse begin to understand something more precise. Control does not require constant action. It requires the absence of unnecessary action. This is where perception shifts. You begin to see how others move, not just what they do, but why they do it. You notice how quickly people react to discomfort, how predictably they seek validation, how easily their behavior can be anticipated once their fears are visible. And you recognize it, because you have already removed it from yourself. The patterns are no longer hidden. They are obvious, not because others are simple, but because most never question the structure they operate within. They remain consistent, and consistency without awareness becomes limitation. This is why control rarely needs to be asserted. It is recognized, not through force, but through absence. The absence of reaction, the absence of desperation, the absence of dependency. These absences create uncertainty, and uncertainty draws attention. People attempt to understand what cannot be easily read. They test it. They observe it. They try to provoke it, but without access to predictable responses, their efforts lose direction, and over time, they stop, not because they have been defeated, but because there is nothing to engage with. This is the outcome most misunderstand. It is not dominance. It is not superiority. It is inaccessibility, not complete isolation, but controlled exposure. You decide what is seen, what is expressed, what is withheld, not to manipulate, but to prevent being manipulated. Because once behavior becomes selective, it becomes difficult to use against you. This is where the old idea of self dissolves completely. There is no longer a fixed personality to protect, no image to maintain, no consistent pattern that must be preserved. Only a system that adapts without losing control. And that system does not require validation. It does not require agreement. It does not require recognition. It operates regardless. This is why it appears detached. Not because it lacks awareness, but because it is no longer dependent on external input. The world continues as it always has. People pursue comfort. They defend their identities. They react to what disturbs them and cling to what reassures them. Nothing about that changes. What changes is your position within it. You are no longer fully inside those patterns, but you are not outside them either. You move through them without being defined by them. And that creates a distance, a quiet separation that others can sense but not fully understand. Some will interpret it as confidence, some as indifference, some as something else entirely. The interpretation is irrelevant, because it no longer alters your behavior. This is where most expect a conclusion, a final state, a stable version of self that remains unchanged. But that expectation is another illusion. There is no final version, only maintenance. The process does not end. It stabilizes. You continue to observe, to remove, to adjust. Not because something is wrong, but because stagnation reintroduces vulnerability. The moment awareness decreases, patterns begin to rebuild, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed, until they are active again. So the process continues, not aggressively, not obsessively, but consistently. And in that consistency, something becomes clear. You were never becoming stronger. You were becoming less accessible to what weakens you. There is a difference. Strength can still be challenged, still be provoked, still be drawn into reaction. But inaccessibility offers nothing to engage with. It does not resist. It does not confront. It simply does not participate. And what does not participate cannot be controlled in the same way. This is the part most avoid, because it removes something they are attached to. The need to be seen, the need to be understood, the need to be acknowledged. Without these, there is no external confirmation, only internal alignment. And that alignment is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It exists without needing to be noticed, which is why it is often overlooked. But not by everyone. Those who understand patterns recognize it immediately, because it cannot be easily influenced. It does not shift under pressure. It does not reveal more than it intends. And that makes it difficult to approach, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. And uncertainty limits control. Oh! In the end, nothing was added. Nothing was discovered. Nothing was revealed that was hidden beneath the surface. What happened was removal, layer by layer, reaction by reaction, illusion by illusion, until what remained could no longer be easily shaped by anything external. That is all. Not a better version, not a higher form, just something that no longer responds the way it once did. And in a world that relies on predictable reactions, that absence is enough.